in the same way that a safety data sheet should be supplied free of charge, emergency phone number information should be supplied free of charge or only at a normal charge out rate. You should not be being penalised for accessing information that by definition is to do with being in an emergency. Now I'm just going to go and check and see if there are any queries. Can you hear me all? Yeah, so we've got Lizzie saying yes, and Nigel and Kate are typing now. Yep, all good, no queries. Right, that's great. So we'll go back onto section 2 of the SDS. Section 1 is particularly important because there are all these pitfalls, really. Right, section 2. This is hazard identification, and there are 3 aspects to this. There's the actual GHS/CLP classification of the substance or mixture. There are the label elements that we've already covered in the rest of the training course, and we've got other hazards. The classification of the substance or mixture goes into section 2.1. It should include the hazard class, for example, phlegm, liquid and vapor, or acute toxicity, oral or by inhalation or whatever. It should have the hazard category, that is the Cat 1 or Cat B, depending on which hazard class you're in, and the H code. So for example, you might have acute toxicity oral Cat 2 H300. If you use any abbreviations, and a lot of people use the H code in this section, you've got to put them into section 16E along with their full text. In the past, this is where we put the chip classifications of the mixtures, but you shouldn't put them here anymore. They should be voluntarily under section 16 if you want to do this, but in theory it's best practice not to have any chip information on your safety data sheet now. Right, section 2.2 label elements. The principle here is that you are mimicking everything that is on your label, with the exception of the product identification that's already been done under section 1.1. So you have the pictograms, you have the signal word, and the great thing about the safety data sheet is you can actually type in no signal word. You can't put no signal word on the label, but you can put it in here. The hazard statements, which can either be the H code or it can be the full text. You can use both. If you only have the H code, you've got to give the full list in the section 16. Similarly, all your P statements, you should have, now then at this point, you should have the P statements that you have on the label. That is your maximum 6 or 7 in extreme circumstances. It's optional to use the P code, or you can have both the P code and the P statement text. The reason being that we only have the 6 or 7 P statements actually on the label is because this is the label element section. We're mimicking what happens. We also want the EUH statement, and again the EUH number is optional. The EUH statement and everything else that we're now into is the supplementary information on the label. So that goes in the extra bit of the label and away, slightly away if you can manage it, from the hazard and the precautionary statements. So you've got the EUH statements. If it's authorised or any component substances are authorised, this is where the authorisation number should go. If there are any restrictions that have particular bits of information, such as restricted to professional users, they would go in here. If there are any other label elements required under national legislation, for example, there are aerosols or laundry liquid tabs or other special cases, because laundry liquid tabs can be used by professionals, not just by consumers. And I also think this is the point where you would put in your UFI. Section 2.2 is really the only place on the safety data sheet where you put your EUH statements, because they're not part of the formal CLP GHS classification. I have seen them included in section 2.3 before. as sort of backing up what section 2.2 says. If the product is not classified under CLP at all, you may want to put in text here, not classified or not classified for CLP. And similarly, if you've got a lot of products that or products that are EUH208, which often happens where you're doing fragrances or flavorings, then you may say not classified for CLP GHS, but EUH208 applies. In principle, as I've said, the product information should match that on the product label. So where you've omitted any H statements that are allowed, for example, you're only showing H410 on the label, then you only have H410 in section 2.2. But of course you might also have your H400 and H410 in section 2.1, which is the classification in full. And don't forget any abbreviations go into section 16. You can put not applicable or none if you don't have any EUH statements, or omit the title text. Now, what happens with all the P statements you've generated to get to your choice of P statement? Well, you can, in theory, put it into this section here. But if you are going to put it into 2.2, you should say, you know, other potentially applicable P statements. And it's much, 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 much better to actually put them in section 16, because they're extra information. They're information that somebody who is then using your product in a mixture may need to know, but if you put them in 2.2, you get that mismatch with the label, which we're trying to avoid as much as possible. I'll just check back. Yep, everybody's fine at the moment. Good. The other hazards. Now, this is your big moment. You can say if it's PBT or VPVB here, although there is a particular subsection later on in the safety data sheet as well, but quite often people will say if something's PBT or VPVB at this point. Is the product a substance of very high concern? That is it on the candidate list? You already know if it's been authorized because you've got the authorization number. So if it's an SVHC, it can be good to say what it is at this point. What quite often happens with SVHC candidates is that everybody is supposed to identify them, but all they do is they put them in section 3.2 or 3.1 if it's an SVHC impurity in a substance, and they don't actually say it's an SVHC. So the poor person who is reading the safety data sheet is being given this information and they're being told, oh, we're just telling you it's this, and it's up to you to go and read the entire candidate list and decide whether it's an SVHC or not, which kind of seems to be, to me, duplication of effort. You know it's an SVHC, so if you know it's in there, it would be sensible to put it in at this point. I should say these headings are all the PBT, VPVB, SVHC wells. These are my completely non-mandatory subheadings. It's just something that will help you work through and make sure you've included everything. The workplace exposure limit you may want to identify here as well. And there's a very interesting situation that's been discussed at length on the CHCS forum, which is that should you identify a component substance with a workplace exposure limit if it's in solution and cannot be inhaled? But because most workplace exposure limits are for inhalation. So if you're in that situation, you've got a component substance, or perhaps more than one, that's got a workplace exposure limit, you may want to say contains XXX, whatever the substance is, in solution, which has a workplace exposure limit. If the mixture dries out, there may be inhalation risks from this substance. It's not my idea, but I think it's a very good one, because then you are covering your backs in terms of trading standards and general Health and Safety at Work Act duty of care, because you are identifying the fact that in the event there's a spill and something's allowed to dry out, there will be a new risk. The actual discussion from this, I think, was prompted from somebody who works in Germany, where this kind of thing is taken even more seriously than we take it here. It's good practice to identify sensitizers, which I think is better to state the information here and it's better to have it in twice than not being identified at all. But of course I would say that with my allergic hat on. And dust explosion may form explosible dust-air mixture if dispersed. That's a good one for a powder or a solid which may have some powder attached to it, and you know it's potentially going to explode. Now, if you may remember, John in the training course said that there's a SDS, which is the German competent authority. They have a SDS database with minimum explosion energy for explosive dusts, and he very kindly sent me that link through, and I'm in the process of putting it into the correct bit of the knowledge base. And I'll try and remember to add it in here, because this is the point where you may want to go and just check and see if it's has it got a chance to explode. You may have other non-CLP hazards, all the ones we've talked about, such as asphyxiation hazard, freezing, cross-sensitization, if new products are released to air. Oh my god, I do apologise. And you can have extra environmental effects in if you think that these are appropriate. So again, this is an important part of the SDS, because you are identifying all of the likely hazards that you can think of. And again, Lizzie and I had a think about the product that we were discussing the other day. It's got a lot of water in it, but apart from that, it's got some cellulosic products. It's got a couple of, I think, potassium salts. So the cellulose will biodegrade, and could potentially, if it's spilled in a large quantity, could have a deoxygenation effect. One of the things to think about with phosphate salts, not potassium in this case, but phosphate, is occasionally you can get a big spill which will eutrify water. But I'm getting away from the subject. I'm talking about environment, so we shall have a think. Any questions? No questions so far on section 2? Right. Time for section 3 then. Hopefully it's not going to take so long to go through. Some of these sections are more serious than others. Section 3 of the SDS. This is a bit you can omit. You're either 3.1 substance or 3.2 mixture. For a substance, you're going to have your substance name, your identification number or numbers, so your CAS number, your INEX number, or EC number rather, because an EC number can be INEX or E-links or nons. E-links, which is non, sorry, or no longer polymer, and the percent weight of the substance. If you've got any impurities, you should also identify them here. The impurities that you identify are those which affect the classification of the substance. Or equally, if they are perhaps sensitizing impurities, if they've got some other hazard that you want to communicate the risk of to your end user. If you've registered for REACH, then this should match the REACH registration information if you or your supplier have registered that substance. So when you've gone through REACH registration, you don't need to worry about what you put in there. It should just be dropping in the information that you've already been given or have provided. You don't put classification information here because you've already given it in section 2.1 of the SDS. But if you've got an impurity, it makes sense to include the classification for both the pure substance and the impurity, so that people can see how the impurity affects the substance classification. But that's a nice to have. Nobody's forcing you to do that, as far as I know. And mixtures. Now, mixtures, as we know, are a bit of a pain. The substances to be identified on mixture SDSs have to meet particular criteria. They either have to be present or above the generic cutoff limits in a table given below, or other cutoff limits for that substance if you've got specific concentration limits or M factors, and there's particular guidance documented ECHA on that. If the substance is a sensitizer at EU H2O8 level, and we're talking about 10% of the EU H2O8 level, you identify it on the safety data sheet. And if the substance has a workplace exposure limit, it should be identified at this point. There's been some debate lately about whether or not there's a cutoff limit of 1% or whether it's in any concentration. So if you do have a component substance with a workplace exposure limit, the safest thing to do is to include that information full stop. If a substance has been authorised for specific uses and is present at or above 0.1%, and substances on the candidate list which have not been authorised but which are present at or above 0.1% in the mixture. The substance doesn't, this is a point we were discussing a minute ago, the substance does not have to be identified as being on the SVHC candidate list. It just needs to be listed there, but it's good practice to put bracket SVHC or SVHC candidate. You also have substances which are PBT or VPVB at or above 0.1% of the mixture, and because I know Ollie's here, we've got a little table as an infographic, yay! And these are the generic limits, things like aspiration hazard, you only list if it's 10%, for example. If the mixture is not classified for CLP, then we've got different rules. Hazardous to health or the environment at or above 1% weight or 0.2% volume. Substances with a workplace exposure limit at or above 1% or 0.2%. Substances which are PBT, VPVB above 0.1%. Substances on the SVHC candidate list, whether or not they have been authorised, present at or above 0.1%. Interestingly, do we say PBT or VPVB in the hazardous one? I don't know if we do. I will check that out and get back to you. Trying to find a pen. VPVB, PBT if hazardous. Right, okay. Oh gosh. Right, I don't know if anybody can hear me. I'm going to try Outlook just in case. No. Can anybody hear me? Right, well, I think I'm going to carry on, and if necessary, it's really super important that you make sure that the top end of the concentration range reflects the actual classification of the product. And I think John mentioned that it was very important to check that if you're using software, the software is not giving a wider range than the classification suggests. Just check emails. Nope. No emails have come through yet. Oh. No, I do not want recovery. Yes, thank you. Okay, so confidentiality is the next thing to think about. You can claim confidentiality for substances that are classified with low-level hazards. You shouldn't need to do it for anything that is not classified, because you are not under any obligation to say what it is on the SDS. There is more information on mixtures with confidential component substances page here on the website. Where you claim confidentiality, what you're claiming is for the use of an alternative name, and that you don't need to have any identification numbers, no CAS or EC numbers, and you don't need to put on the REACH registration number. If a substance is authorised, you can't make a confidentiality claim anyway. But even if you're calling it by a generic name, and you're not putting the identity numbers on, you've still got to include the percent weight and the CLP classification. Otherwise, the poor blighter who's using your product will not be able to do their classification. It's a bit of a theme. Ah, Kate has sent a message. Yeah. Ah, I think it's the same one. Oh, Liz, no, sorry, Lizzie sent a message. Can still see and hear you. Oh, bless you, Lizzie. That's great, thank you. Does anybody have any queries that they want to email through at this stage? It's beyond weird that the thing's going funny, and I do really apologise. Normally what happens is we don't use sound on webinars simply because it doesn't seem to work as well as doing things over the phone. But this is the first time we've done a webinar with 3 other locations. So I may be changing our webinar software provider quite soon. Right, carrying on then with harmonized classifications. Where you've got a harmonized classification, you may occasionally have a note, and we've had an example recently where note N, the classification as a carcinogen need not apply if the full refining history is known and it can be shown that the substance from which it is produced is not a carcinogen. This note only applies to certain complex oil derived substances in part 3. Now, this statement is basically conditional. It's saying that in certain circumstances the harmonized classification doesn't apply, or the carcinogenic bit wouldn't apply. If you've got this type of conditional note that affects the classification of your component substance, it's very good practice to actually put note N applies or the other notes which are conditional, because that's then telling the user of your product, hey, we know that you're expecting this to be carcinogenic, but actually we know where it comes from and we know it's not got a carcinogenic feedstock, and actually carcinogenicity is not one of the things that matter. It's all to do with the amount of information that you supply to your end user. You want to make sure that you're not creating queries for yourself. You're explaining just what you need in order that somebody who is picking this up for the first time can go, oh yeah, I can see that, yeah, that's an oil-based product. Normally it would be carcinogenic, but note N applies. Yeah, fair enough, I'm happy with that. That means I don't need to ring them up and annoy them with asking a query. So that's the end of section 3, which is quite long, but it has to be because, again, identifying the composition of what you're selling is an important part of product safety. If there are no other questions, I will just update to see if we've got any. No other questions so far. Let's go on to section 4. Section 4, first aid measures. If you're not a qualified first aider and you've got somebody in your company who is, go and talk to them about it. If you've got a substance that's been registered for REACH, there will be useful information there. Talk to people who handle the product regularly. If you've got a company nurse or a doctor, or you know somebody who's competent in dealing with chemical hazards, talk to them, make a note of what they say, keep records of what you do. The description of first aid measures is the first subsection. Then it's the most important symptoms and effects, acute and delayed. And then thirdly, you've got indication of any immediate medical attention and special treatment needed. There is more specific detail in here than under old SDSs. And the idea is that somebody who is a first aider can come straight to this section and understand what they have to do in an emergency. And that's why it does worry me, this section, as someone who has zero medical training, that if you're dealing with something fairly hazardous, you want to make sure that people are getting the right information at the point where they really need it or their first aider needs it. There are recommended subheadings for first aid measures, and this is actually in the SDS guidance published by ECHA. This is one of the places you can use P statements. If inhaled, if in skin or hair, if in eyes, if swallowed. these are all the starting points for P statements that may be relevant but that you may not have put on the label. Even if in theory they don't apply, if you think they are sensible, feel free to put them in at this point. Other first aid advice, either no first aid advice or particular bits of first aid advice, can also go in at this point. However, with all of this, it's important that if you've got something that's very low hazard, you are not incriminating yourself or making it look like the product is more hazardous than it is. For example, if it's a water-based product and there aren't any organic solvents in there, do you really need to put down if inhaled? Just omit it if there are no inhalation risks. Don't imply that if on skin or air you must wash it all off. If it's a product that is designed to come into contact with skin or is not irritant in any way. So don't sort of have a series of instructions that you put there, even if it's a non-hazardous product, that might imply that the product is more hazardous than originally thought. You put other first aid advice here, and there are a list of items on the various points that you may want to consider. And please, 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 if you are going to avoid mouth-to-mouth resus, for example, if someone's been exposed to cyanides, you've got to put that there. And I also have put a bit in there about do not induce vomiting if you are H3O4, and more details on why you shouldn't do that. Section 4.2, most important symptoms and effects, both acute and delayed. And you can have either no adverse health effects anticipated or some such, or you summarise the most important symptoms. And indication of any immediate medical attention and special treatment needed. This is a point where you might want to talk to a first aider about what's going on. Hopefully, with the products that you all have, there shouldn't generally be much need for immediate medical attention, but you can't necessarily make that assumption. So if you run that past someone, or if you're not the health and safety person, I know Lizzie, you're the health and safety person anyway, but if that's not you, if you've got someone who is health and safety qualified, IOS qualified, and ideally first aid qualified, they can help you with this section, and you should go and talk to them. Just having a quick check to see if we've got any more emails coming through. Nope, don't think so. Ooh. Section 4, right, okay. Now, Kate's asked a good question. In section 4.2, do we basically just need to do a list of every health hazard that the product is classified as in section 2, e.g., would you put in suspected of causing cancer? No, you wouldn't, because what you have in section 4.2 is what somebody needs for an acute problem. This is what you need as first aid. Something that's suspected of causing cancer it may have more important hazards. It may be irritant and you need to wash it off your skin or rinse someone's mouth out in case they've been exposed. So you're looking at the things that would harm people there and then. Have they inhaled something that's harmful, or do they need to go into the fresh air? Have they got something nasty on their clothes that is toxic through dermal contact? Do their clothes need to be removed? Does their skin need to be washed? Have they got something that is corrosive or irritant on their skin and their skin needs to be wiped off? That's the sort of thing that you look in section 4.2. So you would be looking at breathlessness if it was something that was going to affect the lungs. Breathlessness or sore throat. You might be thinking about a rash on the skin. You may be thinking about, but equally you want to say, is it something that's going to happen now, or is it potentially going to happen later? Because what may happen is somebody gets exposed to something and they have no symptoms immediately, but then they go home and they've got a problem. Let me tell you about my little friend at the distillery and the hydrofluoric acid. If you're eating or drinking, you may want to stop. God, I can't remember the chap's name. Perimenopausal memory loss. we spent a couple of days lifting drain covers and checking that the drain map was accurate, and of course it wasn't. Paul his name is, and he's a right sort of Jack the lad. Brilliant. You get to know people really well when you're lifting drains, let me tell you. He was working in a place as a contractor at one of the silicon chip manufacturing places, and everything was in the clean room. It was really rigorous. They had to go in and do something in a bath of hydrofluoric acid, not very big, but where they had silicon chips and where it was part of the etching process. He had 2 sets of gloves on, and unbeknownst to him, there was a piece of silicon, which is very sharp, which actually went through both his gloves, and he didn't know about it at the time. And he went home and he woke up at 1 in the morning and his hand was turning black. Yes, that's why I said not to eat or drink anything. I'm not doing these things for, to scare you, but this did actually happen. Despite the fact that they had this incredibly long risk assessment on both sides, both the silicon chip company and his employers, somebody at the silicon chip company hadn't checked that there were no shards of silicon chip in there, and they weren't allowing Paul's company to check that before he shoved his hand in this small vat. The good news is that because he understood about hydrofluoric acid, he shoved his hand into a carton of milk that he had in the fridge and immediately went to hospital. So if you're dealing with hydrofluoric acid, the amount of information that's out there on first aid, there's loads of information, absolutely loads. What the milk did, by the way, was it turned yellow. It allowed the hydrofluoric acid to desorb out of his hand, and his hand was saved. It is slightly damaged by it, but it was saved. So it was a happy ending in the end. But in that case, if you were dealing with hydrofluoric acid, and I pray that none of you ever get to that stage, but you might, you would take the manufacturer's first aid information, because it comes with a pack about 2 inches thick, and you would put that information in there. So you would say, you may not know if you've been harmed, but this is what's going to happen. It's going to get very painful, it's going to swell up, and your skin may turn black. Necrosis, they call that. So that's what you want in section 4.2. It is a summary. It is not a it's a summary of the important acute things. You don't repeat everything in there, and you can describe it in plain language. You're not forced to put the H statement in again or whatever. Speaking for myself, occupational asthma is a cracker. Isoferone, Fenmedifam, sugar beet, it's the solvent for that, sugar beet herbicide. And the symptoms for me were shortness of breath. I can't think that there was any harm to the airways. It was just shortness of breath that gradually got worse. And the treatment for that was go to fresh air immediately. So it doesn't have to be always particularly high tech, but certainly that's the principle behind it. Okay, has that answered your question? I hope it has. Just drop me an email, yes or no, if there's anything else at that point. But that was a good question, and thank you. I'll give you a minute to send through any other questions that you have, and then we'll go on to section 5. And here's Kate. Yes, that's fine. That's good. That's why it's important to go through all of this as live as we can manage it, because I'd not thought about that question before, and it is a good question, so therefore so I'm going to add Kate's question to our list. By the way, we've got something like 22 or 23 changes to the knowledge base that have come out of the training session last week. So thank you all very much, because you've all contributed. I'm trying to do it around all of my other work. It may take a few days to get them all updated. Some of the updates are absolutely not horrible, but there's a change there, and you suddenly think, oh, and that means this needs to change. So there's a lot of knock-on effects, which is one reason it's taking the time. And we're going to have 3 extra pages, I believe. Gosh, memory loss again. But under special cases, one for special cases where we have got you don't need to register for REACH, but you still need to classify for CLP. There's going to be one for e-liquids, and then there's going to be one for something else. Anyway, I believe have we got a new email? Let me check. No, we haven't. Right, fine. Okay, so section 5. Section 5 is, again, you need to talk to somebody who knows about this. Some of the P statements that may be applicable may give you information. Bretherick's may have some information as well. Bretherick's Handbook of Reactive Chemicals. Excuse me. That is a really, really, really good book. It will tell you how different chemicals interact. It's helpful for storage incompatibilities. It's also very, very helpful for other bits of the safety data sheet. You can talk to your firefighting team at your fire brigade. I don't call them fire service. I'm old school. It's the fire brigade. They will come in and talk to you about things. They may not be chemical specialists, but they can certainly help with the type of firefighting equipment that they have on hand. Knowledge of physical chemical properties of the product is helpful. And Ollie, this is for you. If you are not a trained chemist, talk to somebody who is. And again, if you have a health and safety specialist, they can help you. There are only 3 bits in this: extinguishing media, special hazards arising from the substance or mixture, and advice for firefighters. Suitable extinguishing media can be things like water or foam or sand. Unsuitable extinguishing material, from my time in helping the whisky industry, alcohol, ethyl alcohol, ethanol, is a complete pain in the neck, because depending on the strength of the alcohol, you may need 5 to 10 times the volume of water to extinguish a fire. So you can increase the size of a burning pool quite significantly and spread the fire that way. So for alcohol, quite often people will say you need ARAFF foam, which is alcohol resistant something forming foam. I can't remember what the AFF bit is, sorry. But you can get information on certain things from textbooks. For example, I've got, turns around, tries to find it. The NFPA, that's the National Fire Protection Association in America, have quite a good textbook that will help with compatible extinguishing media. Sometimes even fire extinguisher manufacturers will say not suitable for or suitable for. There may be information out there that gives you fire extinguisher compatibilities. I'm sure I've seen one in the past. I'll see if I can get hold of that. Be careful when you say extinguishing media. It's better to check. If it's something aqueous, then usually water is okay, alcohols being the exception. Aqueous film forming foam, by the way, alcohol resistant aqueous film forming foam. So you get AFF, which is aqueous film forming foam, but because of alcohols are special, we need this special expensive AFF foam. Special hazards arising from the substance. You need to put in your hazardous combustion products. As any chemist will tell you, this is usually things like water, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide for a straightforward hydrocarbon, but it can include oxides of sulfur or nitrogen, or if it's not flammable, then not applicable. You may have other special hazards. For example, aerosols may create missiles during a fire, or you may have a gas released during a fire, which is not a combustion product, depending on how the product's packed and stored. Again, if you are not a chemist, Ollie, I would say I'm looking at you, but I can't see you. Then you may be a chemist, but you know, you're certainly a formulator. But if you're unhappy with your reactive chemistry, then this is the point where you go and talk to people about it. Sorry, Nigel, I should be talking to you really, because I know you're the person who has you feel that you're not qualified in this area, says she, trying to not land herself into an even bigger hole. Right, okay. Have I been horrible to everybody now? I do apologise. Right, okay. Advice for firefighters. There are certain things that certain products need, like keeping the containers cool with water spray. If you want to say anything, sometimes standard firefighting PPE may be worn. What I tend to do if there are strong acids or alkalis is I will put in here if you need an acid suit. If they need special protection against corrosives, that's really important as well. But again, if in doubt, talk to somebody who is more experienced than you are, and that I am as well. Talk to people, see what might happen, see if you can imagine what the worst case scenario is between you, and therefore what should happen during a fire. Is everybody happy with that? I will assume so and go on to section 6. I'm sorry this is going to overrun a bit, just because it was so long with the tech. Right, section 6, accidental release measures. We've got personal precaution, protective equipment and emergency procedures. We've got environmental precautions, methods and material for containment and cleaning up, and reference to other sections. This is really where you want to grab your health and safety person on site, assuming they've got sufficient chemical knowledge. And I've got at least one chemical company where they have actually hired for the second time someone who is even less qualified in chemistry than I am, and I think doesn't even have a GCSE in chemistry, which is quite bad really. This is where you get into full on someone with IOSH on site. Go and sit them down, get them a coffee, and go over what you need to know. The good thing is, like everything else, you've probably got groups of products and they have the similar risks. So once you've done one, you can port that information over into another SDS as long as it's related enough. You know, sort of closely related enough. Sorry, that's Outlook coming through. Personal precautions. You may want to say non-emergency personnel PPE, such as normal PPE. You may want to specify gloves, masks, goggles. Where you've got someone who's IOSH qualified like John, he will explain that if you've got the risk of splashing, then that's a face mask. Goggles are required for eyes. So don't think by specifying a face mask the eyes will be protected. They're not. So you might need to say goggles and face mask. That's the sort of thing that you would use for corrosives to eyes, for example. But again, you need to have someone who is a health and safety expert who can help with that. Emergency responders PPE, you really need to be talking to an expert on this. Obviously, if you've got acidic fumes being released, then you've got to put down emergency breathing apparatus. But don't do that without checking with somebody who knows about that kind of thing, because there are different types of emergency breathing apparatus and you don't want to be held responsible for sending people in who were incorrectly specified. Controlling risks from accidental release. In this case, things like removing ignition sources or controlling dust or keeping away from flammables. Think to yourself, right, a spill's happened. What would I personally want to have if I was going to tackle it? And also any emergency procedures, like do you evacuate the danger area? Should you ring somebody from help? Particularly with flammables, make sure that people don't do anything electrical. The reason for that is most switches in a normal room, all switches, will give a spark when you turn the light switch on and off, for example, and that spark is enough to trigger a gas explosion. And a lot of times when you see houses that have been blown to bits because there's been a gas leak into them, it's somebody coming home and turning the light switch on that's been the trigger for the explosion. So talk to your health and safety person about this. Environmental precautions. a lot of things is just keep away from drains or surface water. Anything with aquatic toxicity, you should say keep out of drains, keep away from surface water, keep away from soil and open ground or boreholes, that sort of thing. Method and material for containment and spill cleanup. There are some standard phrases. Surround the spill with absorbent material and then use absorbent on the inside. Cover any nearby drain covers, or cover dusts with a cap, or you may, if it's a dust spill, it may be appropriate to say suppress the dust with a water spray. To clean a spill, you may want to consider neutralization if it's acid or alkali, or to use more absorbent materials, or wet vacuuming or dry vacuuming or mopping. And you may need some P statements here. For example, if it's flammable, do you need to use non-sparking tools? There's a P statement for that. You can drop that in there. And you can also include other information like never use certain things. For example, if you've got some kind of material which somebody might say, oh, it's an acid, I'm going to add an alkali to it, and you might go, no, don't use that particular one because we know it's incompatible. That information, if you don't already know it, will come out of a textbook like Bretherick's. References to other sections. For information on PPE to be worn during a release, see section 8.2, or information on waste disposal measures, see section 3.1, etc. They like you to cross-reference. They'd rather that you refer to other bits of the SDS at various points, or have information in twice. Better to have it in twice than not have it at all, is my theory. I've got some more work from Card Factory to do. Isn't that fun? Very helpful of them. Okay, so section 6, everybody all right on? We'll have a quick look at section 7. Section 7 is handling and storage. And again, this is where your health and safety people come in. If you're a chemist, you may already know a bit about it, but the person who is on site and presumably responsible for handling this substance will be your health and safety person. They will have thought about it. They will have done a risk assessment to protect your own workers. Therefore, they will know about what they would recommend for safe handling. Of course, you always have to remember that what's safe handling in your industrial site may be over the top if you're doing very small packs for professional use. Safe handling recommendations. Prevent dust through local extraction system. Fire prevention information. Again, some of the P statements may be helpful here. Do not handle or store near incompatible substances. By the way, there's a very, very good guidance document from the HSE on chemical storage, chemical warehousing, and they've got a really good incompatibles diagram in there, which we may have on this page, and if not, I will send it through to you. Reducing environmental risk, avoid spills, handle with a spill kit nearby, and occupational hygiene advice such as do not eat, drink or smoke in work areas, wash hands after using product and before eating, drinking or smoking, remove potentially contaminated clothing and protect. All of those are P statements. Pop them in there if you think it's appropriate. Conditions for safe storage including any incompatibilities. This has got 4 voluntary subheadings. Managing risks during storage, controlling effects of ambient conditions, maintaining the integrity of the product, and other advice. There are an awful lot of things that can go wrong during storage, and they quite often lead to very nasty accidents. So this is another really important part of what you're describing. Explosive atmospheres. If explosive atmospheres can be formed during storage, then you should be speaking to an expert about this. You've probably got a DSEER assessment which will have been done either by your health and safety person or by an external consultant. Talk to the person who has done your DSEER assessment. Corrosive conditions during storage. There may be corrosive vapours, the substance may corrode the container, a whole load of information like that. Flammability hazards. You may have flammable vapour during storage, or it may be a flammable product. Incompatible storage and mixtures. Evaporative conditions. If you've got something with a solvent in it, it is highly likely that it will evaporate at the slightest chance, you may want to ensure that the product's kept cool, and this also applies to flammable or potentially explosive things. Think about how it should be kept cool. Your formulators should have information, if it's a mixture, on what you need to do for safety, to ensure safe storage, and also for product life. But the most important bit of this is for safety reasons, not for product life information. Your shelf life information should really go in your technical data sheet. And also information on potential ignition sources. For example, store away from ignition storage, store in an electrically safe area. Earth containers to protect against static discharge. P statements will come in at this point as well. You also may need to control ambient conditions. You may want the material stored indoors, or maybe it should be stored out of doors, or it may be kept out of the rain. You may need to keep it in an area where pressure is controlled. You may need to store it between particular temperatures. You may want it stored out of direct sunlight or in a dark place. You may need to control the humidity, and you may also, particularly for things that are sensitive to vibration, you may want them stored in a quiet area away from vibrations. Normally that applies to things like explosives or pyrophoric materials or oxidizers. So it's proper chemistry, this. I'm just going to check and see if we've got... Section 6. Kate has a question. In section 6.2, a statement like this: inform respective authorities in case of seepage into watercourse or sewage system. What environmental hazard class would you say triggers this? H400 and H410, or H411, H412 as well? No, that's fine. Sorry, it is running on longer than I thought as well. And yes, you will be able to catch up, hopefully, if the recording's working. I think that it depends on the degree of hazard and the quantity of release, really. You may be better off informing everybody on all of the H400s, just to be on the safe side. Certainly 410, 411, 400, I would reckon you should probably inform. So going back to safe storage, stabilizers in the product, antioxidants in the product. Put information if you have it. If you've got a stabilized product, it's really super important, particularly if you're dealing with monomers that may polymerize, or with products that have antioxidants to stop them going on fire. And also any other advice like ventilation requirements, whether or not there should be retention walls, whether or not the storage rooms or vessels. You do not need to put in specific things like it's got to be bundled storage. If it has to be bundled storage, that should be obvious to the people who are receiving it. But in some conditions, if you're saying it needs a specific storage room, you may want to say it's got to have ventilation of X and it's got to be bundled, because storage rooms are not generally bundled, but tanks for bulk products generally are. And you may need quantity limits for storage conditions, maximum storage amount. This is for things that when they're stored in bulk can actually have extra risk. For example, some of the oxidizers, once they get above a certain mass, can then generate sufficient heat to have a runaway and a fire. And also suitable packaging for the substance. For specific end uses, this is where you put an outline of all your REACH registered uses. And you may want to put safe use or handling here if a specific use differs from the guidance in the rest of the SDS. I'm just going to check and see if... right, I think where we are now, if we get to section 8 and then we call it a draw for today, I think we will need to regroup. I'm sorry this is taking longer than I realised, but I will do section 8 and then we will pack up, because Kate's got to go in 10 minutes and it seems like a good place to finish. Section 8 of the SDS is about exposure controls and personal protection, control parameters and exposure controls. This is where your on-site health and safety manager is absolutely essential, or an external health and safety consultant if you use them. It's very helpful if your health and safety person is an expert in COSH rather than just general health and safety, as I've mentioned earlier. Control parameters. This is where you put in your occupational exposure limits. This is for all substances with a workplace exposure limit, whether they have a CAS number or not. This includes European workplace exposure limits and national exposure limits. And this is a link to a different SDS database which has got non-UK workplace exposure limits, so you can actually go and check. The UK list is EH40, which is downloadable from the link here, but lead as a metal or compound has a workplace exposure limit, but it's so severe it's got its own control of lead at work regulations, and there is a link to that there as well, that document there. Biological limit values are where you would monitor people's blood for something like lead that they might be exposed to, and these are given either in EH40 in the UK or in control of lead at work in the case of lead in the UK, and they should be listed on JESTIS as well, that JESTIS database. If there are any current recommended monitoring procedures, this is where you put them. If there are any air contaminants formed when the product is used as intended. Now this is where if you've got something that's being cured and it is forming a hazardous substance during the curing process, this is where you put the information there and any occupational exposure limits that occur. 8.15 is PNEX or DNELs. Now this is REACH information. It should be available to you for registered substances. PNEC is predicted no effect concentration, which is for environment, and DNEL is derived no effect level, which is for health and safety. So where you have gone through a REACH registration, the information on PNECs and DNELs will be provided to you as part of the information that you buy, or you will have somebody else in regulatory affairs who's gone through and generated that information. And the information should be placed in your safety data sheet at this point. I'm assuming that none of us here are going to be doing PNECs and DNELs, so we just need to know where to get that information from. Oh, no, that's fine. Right, exposure controls is the second part. This is engineering controls, for example, whether ventilation is needed, dust suppression. Oh, and I would say at this point that if you have, if you've gone through REACH, a lot of this information will be provided to you. Engineering controls like ventilation and dust suppression, personal protective equipment, eye protection, face protection, hand protection, other skin protection, respiratory protection, thermal hazards, and also environmental exposure controls. I'm going to finish off by saying you have to be careful when you say you need safety glasses or safety goggles. You have to be careful whether there's a face shield, and you want to be sure that you are specifying the correct piece of PPE. And this is where your health and safety person comes in. In particular, if you don't know what the end use is of a product for a glove, obtain professional advice as to the gloves to be worn is a good catch-all phrase. And that was recommended on the CHCS forum by a chap who is a dermal toxicity expert. If there's a danger that if you specify the wrong type of glove, something that will go through latex but won't go through nitrile rubber, and you put latex instead of nitrile rubber by accident, you're laying yourself open to being sued, you're laying yourself open to people being exposed. So gloves are a bit of a not a grey area, but an area where expert advice is definitely required. You may decide that other skin protection is required, and you can include things like gauntlets, boots, bodysuit, acid suit, specific hygiene measures like shower after handling, that sort of thing can go in there, and also respiratory protection, either not required or you have to specify the type of equipment to be used. So is it particulate filters, is it masks, do you need some form of breathing apparatus? And it's really important that you talk to an expert in this area to make sure you are specifying the correct equipment so that the reader of your SDS is receiving the correct information. And you also need to put in if there are any thermal hazards. And don't forget that can include cold as well as heat. If you've got something that is going to give someone a freezer burn, then they may need to know that they will have to have gloves, and thick gloves at that, before handling it, just to avoid that risk. And 823 is environmental exposure controls. Do not release substances to sewer or surface water, etc. So everybody, I think I'm going to pack up here. I hope you've enjoyed the first half of this. We're going to have to regroup again. I'm sorry about it taking longer than realised. But obviously we did overrun rather in the training course because it's new and you're all my little guinea pigs, you lovely people. If you can all just send a quick email through. Kate, I know you may be gone anyway, but Lizzie and Ollie, if you can send an email, and Nigel send an email, and we'll look to regroup hopefully sometime next week if that's okay with everybody.